today. My wife, as you all know, she has not fled south for the winter. I know she hasn't been able to come for the past couple weeks. We've had the flu this week. Myself, I've had it. Hadley still has the flu, and that's where they are today. So it's been a fun sickly week at our house. So just please pray. What you got?
You want the lights on?
I'm good actually, unless you need them. Anybody else need the lights? You good? All right, good deal. So please pray for them. But I'm glad to be with you here today. It's funny, and it's happened to me ever since I came to Anchor almost a year ago. When I first started joining the preaching team, I was preaching a lot about Jesus feeding a lot of people. You know, I preached the sermon about the 5,000 and then the 4,000. It came just about every time I preached. I was talking about Jesus feeding people. Well, this will be the second time I have to deal with a guy named Judas. Last time that I preached, I talked about Judas. And the time before that, I preached that I talked about Judas. So here's the hat trick, as it were, about Judas. And this has become the fruition when he betrays Christ. And what we have at this point in Matthew's gospel, that's 26 chapters in the making, from Christ's birth to his childhood, to his beginning of ministry and calling disciples and teaching and healing and all of these things. It's like a wave that's been building and about to crest now as we arrive at the cross. This is it. At this moment, this is God's plan in action. What's been building and the years of trying to find a way to trap Jesus, this is the moment that Jesus will give himself over to be arrested and to be killed. You know, this is what my professor would call the fullness of time. This is the fullness of time. This is the moment God is going to use to bring about what's known as the hour of sacrifice. You know, all the momentum has been building since Jesus' first miracle. And it began at the dawn of history when the promise of Savior was made, and way back in Genesis chapter 3. Way back at that moment when Eve, disobeyed, and God said he will send the offspring to come crush the head of the serpent. So it's not an exaggeration or really anything to say that no event in human history has impacted humanity like the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. And it begins at this moment. Everything that took place before looks toward it. Everything that has taken place since looks back at this moment. And it's even, as even how we label our books, before Christ and BC, and I know we've changed that since. It was funny hearing our principal explain to a student why we don't use AD and BC anymore, and that was a fun conversation, to hear why we use Common Era and stuff like that. But for those of us who claim Christ, who claim to belong to him, the cross is, I think you've heard me say this before, is central to everything that you are. It's central to everything that we believe. The cross and the resurrection are what make us, our faith and our trust in that are what make us followers of Jesus Christ. And it's what is every action that we participate in is to be made by that faith. And so it stands as such an iconic image, the cross does, because it can be traced back to this moment when God offered his son as a penalty for our sins. So this is a very sincere, serious moment when Jesus is betrayed, because he is, in a sense, what I want you to see today, in a sense, giving himself over. God extended the terms of peace to his enemies at the cost of his son's life. And ever since then, it's been this question of who's responsible for the cross, who murdered Jesus, right? Bill O'Reilly, I think, wrote a book about murdering Jesus. I have not read it, but if you have, he has that great series, Killing Jesus and Killing Kennedy and killing all of them. So everyone is very, who killed Jesus? Did the Romans kill Jesus? Crucifixion was not a Roman invention, but it's one they perfected. They were great at killing people with the cross. And that was their preferred method of dealing with their most serious criminals. It's why the theory of Jesus only swooned on the cross and didn't die. If you know anything about Romans and Roman history, they were efficient killers. They weren't merciful people. If they said they were going to kill you, they were going to kill you. And so they're the ones, again, they were charged with when Jesus was crucified. Pilate ordered his death. He was the Roman governor. Roman soldiers pounded nails into Jesus' hands and feet. So they were participants, right? Did the Jewish leaders kill Jesus? Did they murder Jesus? They're the ones that arrested him. They brought him to Pilate, demanded he be killed. When Pilate wanted to release Jesus, right? Wanted to let him go, just wanted to have him flogged and sent on his way. They chanted and incited the crowd to say, crucify him. You see that in Luke 23:21. They said, put it in Matthew 27:25, we read, they said, his blood be on us and our children. What a thing to say. You better be for sure about what you're doing if you're saying his blood can be on us and our children. Did we murder Jesus? It wasn't just the sin of the Romans and the Jews that caused Jesus to die. It was your sin and my sin that caused him to die. Isaiah 53:6 says, we all went astray like sheep. We all have turned to our own way. The Lord has punished the iniquity of us all. So none of us are off the hook, right? Jesus died because of our sin. And all these are correct when asking who killed Jesus. They're correct in part. But this is the one I want to go back to. When I talk about Jesus being arrested and happening on this night, in this moment, that in every step, the way the cross is planned and controlled by Jesus, Jesus gave himself over to be arrested. Jesus allowed himself to be arrested. He allowed himself to be flogged. He allowed himself to be killed because he was obedient to the Father, even to point to death and death on the cross. And obedience is very much about who Jesus is. And it begs that question that all of us have, what is God's will for us in our life? We all have that big question, right? What is God's will? There's been books, you hear about the purpose-driven life. That's all about your purpose in life, correct? Finding your purpose and finding your will. What we see in the life of Jesus, that he is willing to lay down his life in obedience to the Father, because that was the Father's way of making sin no more and making a way back to him. Jesus says in John 10:17-18, I lay down my life so that I may take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I'll lay it down on my own. And that's very important for us to understand as we talk about the crucifixion, as we talk about the trials and why Jesus kept silent. And all of these things, he says, I lay down my life. I give my life up. So when we look at it from a human perspective, and this is, we can read books and people have these theories that Jesus just got in over his head. And he got swept up in these forces that were out of his control, and that's what happened. But he orchestrates every encounter. Every moment is orchestrated to lead to this. John MacArthur writes, says, God incarnate, Jesus was in absolute control of all the events of his life. There was nothing that he was under the submission. He says, I do the will of my Father because I live to please my Father. That was Jesus' life, and he lived to please his Father. So, included right here as it leads up to his arrest and death. So none of this is an accident, or as we're about to go into, because we're getting into the moments of the arrest and the trials and those things. But so what we do right now also is, so where was Jesus arrested? He was arrested directly after the moment in Gethsemane when he was praying. So you need to understand that Jesus doesn't select the garden as a place to hide. He's not trying to hide out the night. He selects this place as a place to be found. This is a place, he chose this spot because this is where they came to all the time, and Judas would know that. Judas would know this place. He would know this is where Jesus went to pray when Jesus sought the Father. So it was well known to Jewish. It was well known this is where he's going to lay down his life. So it's not like Jesus is being hunted or he's being enveloped by a well-laid ambush by these cunning chief priests and Romans. Judas led them to him, but Jesus is not making himself too hard to find anybody. Anyone. He left that night at the upper rooms we talked about a few weeks ago. He left the light to wander in darkness. And it's so strange, and I know we talked about this, but it's that when you read the gospel accounts of Judas, that he's called one of the 12. Even in the very act of betrayal, they could write anything. Matthew, Luke, Mark, and John could write anything they want to about Judas. Theoretically, they don't. Even they could write this vile, seditious traitor. No, they said one of the 12. That's how they refer to him, or Judas, who would betray him. Matthew would think if you think Matthew would have hated to refer to him in such a way, identifying. So why don't they refer to him as a false disciple? Why don't they, label him in a harsher way? They never individually distinguished him from any. No other disciple is distinguished in such a way as Judas, like one of the 12. They say he's the betrayer, but they don't speak with hatred or disdain. And they never use abusive language about it. Now, there's all kinds of, and I thought about going through all of them this week, but it's such a, it goes beyond the purpose of why we're here. But all the apocryphal stories of Judas and what he did afterwards, and there's all kinds of things. You can find that in your own time to read. But they're just all these fantasies that have been made up about Judas, what happened, and things like that. But they're all written to reveal this contempt and vileness in Judas, but they simply call him one of the 12, or Judas who would betray him. And this is the point of that. They don't minimize the horrible act that Judas commits, but it raises it, because he was one of the 12. He wasn't just part of the crowd that came and went that followed Jesus. He had been with him for 3 years in an intimate setting, knowing him, seeing the healings, hearing the teaching, and then he walked away and betrayed him. He was not some stranger to Jesus. So when Judas came to this garden, he came as to commit the ultimate act of betrayal of a friend, but not only that, to betray the Son of God. And he comes, it says, with these people with all these swords and clubs, and the chief priests and elders. Like, there's this great host. This was a large crowd, okay? And it wasn't just some spontaneous mob that Jesus, that followed Jesus around like the one in John 6, that were like, hey, do the miracle again. They were a carefully selected group of people that were brought together for the sole purpose of arresting Jesus and putting him to death. And they expected some resistance. They expected this was about to be a riot. They were prepared for it. They would have been the temple, officers of the temple. They were like temple police officers. And they had very limited power concerning really anything. So they probably had the clubs. And then there was a cohort of Roman soldiers, which a cohort at full strength was 600 soldiers. So whether it was a full strength or not, there was a large number of Roman soldiers, because they had to have Roman permission to give the death penalty. And so the Jewish leaders requested the Romans be there for the arrest so they could kill him. So there were soldiers from the fort in Jerusalem, the temple police, all armed with swords and clubs. And so, this isn't like, going to arrest us. They really are expecting a fight. Right? You don't go somewhere with all of this and don't expect resistance. Like, they're tough men looking to do tough things. And so they came, and the reason why also the Romans probably went, because with the temple police in John 7:32 went to arrest Jesus one time, and they came back empty-handed. So Jewish leaders had intended to really arrest him, but they were using the Romans. This was the politically savvy people, using the Romans to say the Romans are doing this because Jesus was trying to rebel against Rome. They were being savvy politically, and so they could blame his death on the Romans and not on themselves. So when Judas rushed to get all these people, he had already made this arrangement with all these. So it was this great multitude that could have been, anywhere upwards to almost 1,000 people coming into this garden to get Jesus, which is, it's not a little small mob like we've seen in movies and such, is what I'm saying. This was a big deal that was going on that night. So they included all these high officials. They were not going to let Jesus slip through their fingers that night. And in it, and this is what we're going to say, you see the portrait of the world's treatment of Christ. The cowardness, the wickedness, the mindlessness that they do this in. Many of them had no idea who Jesus was. They were there, they were going to follow through, and they were cowards. Instead of humbly welcoming the Son of God, like the chief priests should have, they don't embrace the long-awaited Messiah. They do all of these things to bring about all this injustice in their accusations and actions which had no relation to truth or anything. Jesus had done nothing. He committed no immoral act, no illegal act. His only offense was obeying man-made law. But the unbelieving world, and this is true today, has always a disdain for God, His Word, and the things of God. No pagan deity is so openly blasphemed by mankind as Jesus Christ. No. Nothing, no one can come up with this so blasphemed than Jesus Christ. So, it's the evidence of a world that is hostile toward God. Evidence of a world that is rejecting God. Delivering Jesus up was in the mind of these men and of Satan. So, here's Judas with his crowd, and doing evil deeds. And this is how he betrays. This is what's important when we talk about the kiss, the Judas kiss, the kiss of betrayal. Because it was dark, and because many in this big group had no idea who Jesus was, Judas was the one betraying him, had this prearranged sign: whoever I will kiss, he's the one. You can seize him. So the kiss is a word from the word phileo, which is a verb, an act of special respect or affection. It's still displayed in Arab cultures, or if you go to Europe, people kissing on the side of the cheek and stuff like that. We don't do that in the United States, or if you do, you're considered kind of weird, right? I don't know, but they just do that. They go, and that's a greeting. During this time, a kiss was a sign of homage. A slave would kiss his master's feet, or kiss seeking mercy from a monarch. Servants would kiss the back of a hand. I mean, sometimes I wish we still did these things, to be honest. I still wish we, offered the ring and kissed the hand. That's just me, though. It's just kind of one of those things. But it was just, it was a sign of reverence and devotion. And then to embrace and kiss on the cheek was a sign of close affection and love. Reserved for only those who had a close, intimate relationship. A kiss and embrace was accepted between a pupil and a teacher. Only when a teacher offered that first. And so, of all the ways Judas could have just pointed to Jesus, or he could have just came up and hugged Jesus, or came and put his hand on his shoulder. He chose this affectionate sign between a teacher and a pupil. He chose the one that would to be the most despicable, because he perverted so hypocritically and treacherously. But for whatever reason he had in his mind, Judas still feigned his innocence. I don't know how that would happen. He's bringing 1,000 people behind him, but he's still acting like nothing. I didn't do it, He's still acting like that. That's why he gives him that affectionate pupil kiss. It's so hard to imagine someone doing this, but it's also hard to imagine what Jesus must have felt when Jesus says, "Hail, Rabbi," and it's this act of betrayal. His grief was not for himself, but for this man who was so engulfed by greed and self-will that he would stoop to betray the dearest friend he ever would have. And so it is intensified, and it was continuous, and it was just this expression of affection. And so, in this deep sadness, he betrays him, and Jesus says, "Friend, do what you've come for. Do what you've come for." And then they begin to seize him. And then, my favorite guy in all of biblical writings is Peter. Because Peter does what Peter does, right? He acts without thinking, right? I'm a big identifier with Peter. Peter and I have a lot in common. As soon as Jesus does this, the soldiers came and laid hands on Jesus. And then Jesus didn't really wait for a reply, but he reached in, drew out his sword, and tried to cut the head off of a guy. But he missed because he's a fisherman. He's not a soldier, and he cut off his ear. All right, it's kind of funny. He's trying to decapitate this guy, right? And he cut off his ear. That's how a fisherman swings a sword. But Peter, none of the other writers identified Peter, but only just how we know it was Peter, because it was John. John has no qualms about telling everybody who it was. So he informs us that Peter struck, even names the man who was Malchus, who was probably in the forefront, probably one of the high priest's slave. And so he cuts his ear off, and Peter was just probably emboldened by what was going on. He was feeling vulnerable. He thought, I'm going to kill as many as I can before they do it. I mean, he was just filled with this adrenaline and heartache, and who knows, he didn't know what he was going to do. He was just doing something. He thought he was protecting Jesus. He thought he was invincible, that Jesus is going to allow him to do this. And here's the point: Peter reacted in the complete wrong way. He did exactly what he was not supposed to be done. In Peter's mind, everything was just spiraling out of control. And I've got to protect my friend. You can feel, and I have a great endearment for that when Peter's like, no, you're not going to die. He was his friend. He loved his friend. In this moment, he loved his friend, but he had missed all the words his friend has been trying to tell him all night, and I'm going to die. Peter's like, no, I'm still going to stop it. And he just can't. He thinks someone needs to take charge, and that's him. But Jesus had wanted this. Nothing was out of step with his will. But Peter's action trying to protect Jesus were useless. They were in denial of why Jesus came. Jesus was born to die. He was not surprised by what happened that night. And that's what you understand. He was not surprised that this multitude came to him. The injustice he is going to suffer is a part of God's rescue of humanity from sin. John Calvin wrote, let us remember that the body of the Son of God was bound in order that our souls might be set free from the bondage of sin. So this is the whole point. He's taking deliberate, controlled steps. He's not a victim. And that's what Peter couldn't accept. And it's the things that we feel like sometimes we need to help God. And in ways that, we need to be warriors and all the holy wars that we can look back through history of people doing things in the name of Christ and end up doing so un-Christ-like things that Jesus actually said don't do. When we try to take the action that Peter did. Jesus came to show us how to die. He came to show us how to submit to the will of God. So at no point did Jesus lose control. And we read that he actually heals this. He puts the ear back on and heals it, which is an amazing thing. Someone's there to arrest him. Jesus actually heals him. He undoes what Peter tried to do. And so there's been questions and this is a pretty straightforward story of what happens in this stuff. This is how Jesus is arrested. This is how he's going to be taken to his trial. So I asked that question. What is the theme of this, or what is being taught to us in this scripture? And it really comes back to seeing the obedience of Christ through all of this, through that lens of him submitting himself to God's will. We hear about him praying in the garden. Lord, if you will, take this cup from me. But Father, not my will, but your will be done. He knows what's about to happen. And is stressed and perplexed by all of it, but he's willing to submit himself to the will of the Father. All of us, a lot of times, have this question about what God's will is in our life, right? What decisions, and I love what Kevin DeYoung says. He says, God is not a magic 8-ball that we shake and he tells us what to do, but that's how we try to treat God sometimes. When I ask him, what is God's will, and what does God want me to do about I can't tell you how many times I was asked to Bethany and I, before we moved up to Maine, how do you know that's God's will? Her mom even asked a bunch of times. When you take someone's daughter away from them to move far, far away, they tend to ask a lot of questions like that. But how do you know this is God's will? And so, was it a sign? Was it a feeling? Was it all these things? And so, talking about knowing God's will is a deep concern, and it's for a lot of people. But we want to live with purpose, and we want to know that we're in God's will. We're obeying God. And Kevin DeYoung goes on to write, the will of God is one of the most confusing phrases in the Christian vocabulary, because sometimes we speak things that are happening according to God's will. Other times we talk about being obedient and doing God's will. And so other times we talk about finding God's will. And so when we talk about the will of God, we tend to wonder what we're supposed to do. But I think in that, and this is something that just really grasped me this week, that what has God called us to do? God has called us to be obedient. So as the lawyer once asked Jesus, what are the greatest commandments? To love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And in this moment, when you see Jesus giving himself over to be betrayed, giving himself over to be arrested, giving himself over to be killed, he's submitting to the Father's will. And so I think, and again, if I'm off, I'm off, but I just believe that with my heart, that we spend so much of our life trying to figure out what God desires for us is that simple obedience, to trust him, to walk with him day by day, to believe that he is in control, that even the decisions we make, we place them and pray for them under his will, to love him and to love other people. I think that's one thing when Jesus talked about in the Beatitudes, when, why do you worry and why are you anxious? He says, seek the kingdom of God and all these things will be added to you. And that's what we're to seek God every day. To seek him, to love him, to give our lives in this simple obedience. And no matter what comes, what diagnosis comes, or trials come, or hurts come, or praises come, whatever you may say, we're just thankful and loving toward our Father. It's very easy to say. It's hard to live. But I really see that in what Jesus said. He was willing to submit to the Father's will, even to the point of death. Even to the point of being put to death on the cross. And that's what you see in all this. This wasn't out of the control of God. This wasn't out of the control. This was absolutely a part of where he was leading his son. And so I ask us, as we're searching, the will of God can be known in Scripture. The will of God can be known in that command. And then everything else, I truly believe, is just us walking. And we get to make, it's not really about option A or option B. Sometimes either one could be the will of God. God's not really concerned about option A or option B. He's more concerned about who you following after him. You growing closer to him. Either one are fine. Because his concern is not always us trying to do this, that, or the other. His concern is us growing closer to him. And being more like Christ, to be obedient in all things and all ways. So I pray for this. Again, I hope I've hit the mark of what God is trying to teach me through this. That's what I'm sharing with you today. I pray God has taught you. And I pray you just continue to do those simple things. I heard my brother Daniel talk about simplicity a lot, and that's something I'm learning in my life. It's really, it's about simple faith and simple love and simple things that we do to search for God. And it doesn't have to be these big, huge gestures. It's just simple acts of faith that we trust in and love God. Let me pray. Lord, I thank you for today. And God, I just ask you, in all of your goodness and in all of your grace, Lord, to lead us to be a people who follow after your will. Lord, I pray that we don't search for meaning outside of you. We don't search for truth. We don't search, Lord, for, God, the things that only come from you apart from you. And so I pray, God, that in all of this, Lord, even as we lift up your word and as we begin to see the events of your trial and crucifixion, Lord, we hear the truth that, Jesus, you were obedient. You were obedient to the will of the Father, and you never once for a moment, never once were you ever abandoned by the Father. So God, I pray that we walk with this confidence every day, knowing that we are yours, if we claim to be yours and actually are yours, God, and that we walk in the simple obedience and simple faith and love